They gave us 48 hours to sign. I sat in the chamber with my hands folded on the table in front of me, and I did not reach for the document. Not because I was afraid, not because I was confused. I did not reach for it because the moment I touched it, humanity would lose something it could never get back. The chamber was enormous. Every seat around the circular table held a representative from one of the 31 species that made up the Galactic Council. Most of them were watching me. A few were pretending not to. The Velhari delegate, a creature shaped like a tall column of pale silver muscle, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on its upper surface, had not blinked once since I entered the room. I had counted 42 minutes. Not once. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 44 years old. I was a contract lawyer for 11 years before Earth's government pulled me into diplomatic work, and before that I spent 3 years doing debt arbitration in conditions that would have made most people quit by the end of the first week. I say this not to impress anyone. I say it because the skill that saved me in those rooms was the same skill that kept my hands still now. I knew how to wait. The treaty document in front of me was 63 pages long. It had been presented to Earth's delegation as a formality, as a welcome into the greater galactic community, as a gesture of goodwill, from species who had watched humanity crawl out of its atmosphere, and finally, reach the stars. The Velhari ambassador had used the word family when he introduced it. He had bowed when he said it. I had read every page, every clause. Every footnote that referred to other clauses in documents I had to request separately, and wait 4 days to receive. I had read those too. Stripped of its warm language, the treaty did one thing. Been mapping for 6 years and handed 61% of it to the Council's 7 founding species. In exchange, Earth would receive what the document called integration support, which, when you followed the footnotes all the way to the appendix, turned out to mean the right to purchase processed minerals from those same territories at Council-approved prices. We would be buying back our own ground. There was a clause in subsection 9 that barred any signatory from beginning independent extraction, operations in council-designated survey zones, without a three-quarter majority council vote. Earth's current survey zones covered most of the regions we had found first. There was another clause in subsection 14 that defined what counted as an independent operation. The definition was precise enough that even a single human-crewed research vessel conducting soil sampling could technically trigger a violation, and there was a clause in subsection 22, buried in the middle of a long paragraph about communication protocols, that required all signatories to route deep space transmissions through the Council relay network for verification and security purposes, which meant that any signal Earth sent to its own ships, its own stations, its own probes, would pass through a system the Council controlled. I had highlighted those three clauses in my personal copy. I had not shared my copy with anyone in the room. The Keth representative, a broad creature covered in layered gray plates that shifted slowly like tectonic movement when it breathed, leaned forward and addressed me directly. The translator bead behind my left ear rendered its voice as a deep, even tone, like someone speaking through stone. It said that the Council understood this was a significant moment for Earth. It said the document had been prepared with care, and with humanity's long-term interests in mind. It said that Earth had much to gain from full integration, and that the Council was committed to making the transition smooth. Then I looked at the document, and I looked at the pen they had placed beside it, and I looked at the Keth representative, and I said, "I appreciate that." And then I was quiet. The Keth representative waited. The Council is prepared to answer any questions you may have. I said, "Thank you." The Velhari delegate shifted. Its four eyes moved from its diamond arrangement into something closer to a horizontal line. I had read enough about Velhari physiology to know that was not a neutral expression. A smaller species on the far end of the table, the Pruin, whose delegate looked approximately like a child's drawing of a crab rendered in deep orange chitin, made a sound that my translator rendered as a polite inquiry about timing. I looked at it. I said, "I understand." The session chair, a tall Marathi whose skin carried faint bioluminescent lines that pulsed in slow waves when it was calm, and rapid bursts when it was not, called a brief recess. The lights in the chamber shifted to a softer tone. Several delegates stood and began quiet side conversations. I remained seated. My aide, a young man named Colin Hartley who had been with me for 2 years and had learned, mostly, to read my silences, brought me a cup of water and did not ask me anything. He stood behind my left shoulder and watched the room. When the session resumed, the Marathi chair announced that Earth's delegation had been given ample time to review the treaty, and that the Council would appreciate a response. Before the end of the current session, I said, "We will require more time." The chair said, "Ambassador, the Council has extended the review period twice already." The Velhari delegate made a sound that my translator did not fully render. The partial output was something like procedural frustration, which I thought was a generous translation. The Council's administrative staff collected the document from the table. A junior Marathi official leaned toward me as I rose from my seat and said, very quietly, that the Council chair would appreciate a private meeting at my earliest convenience. I said I would check my schedule. Colin fell into step beside me as we walked out of the chamber and into the long curved corridor that led to the human delegation's suite. He waited until we were past the first security door before he spoke. He said, "That went well." They are going to come at us hard in the next session. I said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, so what are we doing? I stopped walking. The corridor curved away in both directions, pale and smooth, lit by the council's characteristic blue-white panels that made everyone look slightly unwell. I looked at Colin. He was 29, sharp and patient for his age, but not yet patient enough to understand what we were doing. I said, we are giving them time to wonder. He looked at me. I said, every species in that room spent the last 90 minutes trying to read me. They have behavioral specialists. Right now, those specialists are producing reports. And every single report is going to ask the same question. Colin said, what does she know? I said, exactly. He thought about that. Then he said, but we already know what we know. They know what we know. I said, do they? They handed us a document that should have made us grateful. We were supposed to read it, feel honored, and sign. When we didn't, the first thing they thought was that we found something in the text. Claws we're holding on to. Colin said, all three of them. I said, all three. But they don't know that yet. They'll start with the most obvious one, probably the mining percentages. They'll prepare a counteroffer on percentages. They'll come to the next session confident that they know what we want. He was quiet again. Then he said, and we still won't sign. And we still won't sign. Back in the suite, I opened my personal files and pulled up the transmission logs from Earth. There were 17 messages waiting, 2 from the diplomatic ministry, asking for a status update. One from the Science Directorate, marked urgent, with a subject line that read, Progress Update on Outer Belt Survey Phase 3. One from a man named Gordon Reese, who ran Earth's Deep Space Construction Division, which said simply, 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Thought you should know. I read that last one twice. Then I closed the file, poured myself another cup of water, and sat down to write my response to the ministry. I told them the treaty review was ongoing. I told them the council had been cooperative. I told them that Earth's position remained unchanged. I did not tell them what Earth's position was, because the ministry would have worried, and worried people ask questions, and questions from worried people in the wrong rooms have a way of reaching the wrong ears. They did not know about the survey Phase 3 transmissions. They knew that Earth had probes in the outer belt. They had calculated, reasonably, that those probes were just beginning the kind of work that would eventually, in perhaps a decade, put humanity in a position to claim those resources. They had moved quickly because they believed they had time, but not unlimited time. They were wrong about that, but they did not know it yet, and I was not going to tell them. I finished writing to the ministry. I sent a brief note to Gordon Reese that said only, "Understood. Thank you." Then I turned out the light in my office and sat for a while in the dark. Outside, through the curved, transparent wall of the suite, the station orbited a planet that no human had ever stood on. It was a pale yellow world with 3 thin rings and no breathable atmosphere. The Council had built this station here because no species had prior claim to the space around it. Neutral ground. I looked at that planet for a long time. They had called this a ceremony. They had called it a welcome. They had handed us 63 pages wrapped in the language of family and future, and the greater good of all species. We had read it carefully, and we had not said yes. Humanity. Something they should have figured out long before they invited us to this table. We were not difficult to deal with because we were aggressive. We were not stubborn because we were proud. We were quiet because we were listening. And we had been listening for a very long time. The planet turned slowly outside the window. The rings caught the light of the distant star and scattered it in pale arcs. It was, I thought, a genuinely beautiful sight. I gave myself 2 minutes to appreciate it. Then I got back to work. Colin knocked on my office door at 6 in the morning, station time, with a look that meant something had already happened. I said, "Come in." He sent the invitation 11 minutes after midnight. I said, "Tell him I'm reviewing documents and will respond later today." Colin wrote something on his pad. Then he said, "There's also a message from the Keth delegation. They're asking if we'd be open to an informal technical discussion about the mining allocation clauses." I said, "Tell them we appreciate the outreach and we'll be in touch." He wrote that down too. Then he looked up and said, "And the prune delegate sent a gift basket. It's in the lobby. I don't know what's in it." I said, "Log it and leave it there." He nodded. He turned to go. At the door he stopped and said, "They're all moving at once. That's new." I said, "That's not new? That's panic." He left. I turned back to the window. The planet was in a different position now. The rings tilted at a new angle. The shadow line shifted. 42 hours remaining. I read those 5 words and I let them settle somewhere quiet inside me. Somewhere the council could not reach, and the ministry could not worry about, and nobody else could touch. Then I began preparing for the next session. I was not preparing a counteroffer. I was not preparing demands. I was preparing something much simpler and much more important. I was preparing to sit down again, fold my hands again, and wait. The second session opened with the Marathi chair announcing that several council members had requested the opportunity to address Earth's delegation directly, and that in the spirit of open dialogue, the chair was granting this request. I said, "We welcome open dialogue." The Velhari ambassador spoke first. He said that upon reflection, the council was willing to revisit the allocation percentages in Section 3. He said the initial figures had been preliminary estimates, and that there was room for a more equitable distribution. He used the word partnership 4 times in 6 sentences. He looked at me when he said it, each time, as if the word itself were an offering. I listened carefully. I took notes. I thanked him. The Keth representative followed. It spoke for 11 minutes about the long history of resource disputes in the outer territories, and the importance of clear legal frameworks, and the Council's commitment to fair arbitration. It suggested that a joint oversight committee, with human representation, could manage the survey zones in question. I wrote that down too. Then I folded my hands and waited for the next speaker. By the time the session ended, 3 species had made substantial modifications to their original positions without receiving a single concession in return. The Velhari had moved on percentages, the Keth had offered joint oversight, the Pruin had quietly stopped defending the communication routing clause in subsection 22, which I had noticed, and which meant they were hoping I hadn't. I had. I signed nothing. That evening, Colin and I sat in the small common room of our suite, and I explained to him what I had seen. I told him about the Pruyun's silence on subsection 22. I told him that silence meant they knew the clause was the weakest part of the document. I told him the Velhari's offer on percentages was designed to feel generous while leaving the subsection 14 definition of independent operations completely untouched. Colin said, "So they fixed the number but kept the trap." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do they think we didn't notice?" I said, "They're hoping. When someone moves quickly on the thing they think you want, they're trying to get you to stop looking at the thing they don't want you to see." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's in subsection 14 exactly? I mean, what does it actually do?" We can crew a ship. We can fly that ship to a coordinate in the outer belt that we found with our own probes and name after our own scientists. And if that ship does anything more than take a photograph, the Council can call it a violation and invoke the dispute mechanism in Section 41, Colin said. Which would take how long to resolve? I said. The Council's dispute resolution timeline is a minimum of 9 years. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, we'd own the territory and not be able to touch it. I said, for 9 years minimum. At which point the Council approved extraction operations, run by the founding species, would already be in place, and the area would be classified as an active resource zone, which changes the legal status entirely. Colin set down his cup. He said, that's not a treaty. That's a lock. I said, yes. He said, and they handed it to us with a bow on it. They handed it to us with the word family. He looked at the ceiling. After a moment he said, how long do we keep doing this? I said, until they ask us what we actually want. He said, what if they don't ask? What if they just stop inviting us to sessions? I said, they won't. He said, how do you know? I said, because of Gordon Reese. He frowned. You've mentioned that name twice now. Who is he? I looked at my coffee cup. I said, he runs a construction program. A large one. Colin waited. I said, the Council invited us to this table because they realized Earth was getting close to something. What they don't know is how close we already are. Colin said, close to what? I said, to not needing their rules at all. He was very quiet after that. I let him sit with it. The station hummed with the quiet industry of 31 species who had been doing this for centuries and who had, perhaps, forgotten what it felt like to encounter a species that had read every footnote. In the morning I sent a message to Gordon Reese. It said only, "How is the weather out there?" He sent back a single line. "Clear skies. No clouds. Beautiful." I read that, and I felt something that was not quite relief, and not quite pride. It was something steadier than both of those things, something that sat low and solid in my chest like ballast. I wrote 3 words at the top of a new page. They don't know. Then I began preparing for session 3. The third session started differently. There was no opening statement from the Marathi chair. There was no procedural announcement. The chair simply called the session to order and then sat back and looked at me. And I understood that the format had changed. They were done presenting. They wanted me to say something. I said, "Good morning." Several delegates shifted in their seats. I have been listening carefully to the Council's recent proposals. I want to make sure I understand the direction of the conversation before we go. The Velhari ambassador said that the Council was happy to clarify anything I needed. I said, "That's very kind." I read from them slowly. I described what had changed between the first and third sessions in precise terms. The percentage adjustment. The joint oversight proposal. I simply described what had happened, in order, the way you might read a list of items in a supply report. When I finished, the room was very quiet. I said, I want the Council to understand that we have appreciated the movement, and I want to be clear that Earth's delegation has no desire to be an obstacle. We came here in good faith. The Keth representative said, then perhaps you could tell us what it is that Earth requires. I said, I will. And then I stopped. Not because I was playing a game. I stopped because at that exact moment my communication bead gave the 2-pulse signal that Colin and I had agreed on before the session. It meant a transmission had arrived from Gordon Reese marked priority. I said, please excuse me for one moment. I need to check something. I stepped out of the chamber into the side corridor. Colin was already there, holding a tablet. His expression was one I had not seen on him before. It was the look of someone who has just been shown a photograph of something they were told was impossible. He handed me the tablet without saying anything. The message from Gordon Reese was 12 words. Phase 3 complete. All units operational. Awaiting your word on next step. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I wanted to be completely certain that I understood it completely. Phase 3 complete. All units operational. I handed the tablet back to Colin. I straightened my jacket. I looked at the door to the chamber. Colin said quietly, is this what I think it is? I said, yes. He said, they have no idea. I said, none. He said, what do we do now? I said, now I go back in there and I tell them what Earth requires. He said, and what does Earth require? I looked at the door for a moment. Through it, 31 species were sitting in a room that they believed they controlled. They had built this station. They had written those 63 pages. They had offered percentages and committees and goodwill. And the word family. I said, we require a new document. One that starts from a different place. Colin said, what place? I said, from the fact that we were never asking for permission. I pushed open the door and walked back into the chamber. I sat down. I folded my hands and I looked at the Keth representative, who had asked me the question I was now ready to answer. Exists. Not as it existed 6 years ago when our probes first reached the outer belt. Not as the Council projected it would exist when this document was drafted. As it exists now, today. The Marathi chair said, "We are not certain what distinction you are drawing." I said, "I'll make it clear." I reached into the case beside my chair and placed a single printed document on the table. It was 4 pages long. There were no footnotes. The language was very simple. The outer belt. We now have 9 fully operational extraction and processing platforms running independently of any external relay network. They are crewed, supplied, and connected to each other through a closed communication system built entirely by Earth. They are currently processing material from 14 sites. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are rarely quiet. Not the quiet of people waiting for more. The quiet of people who have just had the floor removed beneath them and have not yet registered the fall. The Velhari ambassador said, "That is not possible." I said, "I understand why you might think that." The Keth representative's plates shifted rapidly. At minimum a decade away. I said, "Our survey data was accurate. Our construction timeline was faster than our survey data suggested." There was a pause. Then the Velhari ambassador said, very slowly, "The transmissions. We should have seen transmissions. The relay network logs all deep space." I said, "We didn't use the relay network. That landed differently than anything else I had said in 3 sessions. It landed because subsection 22 of their document required signatories to use the relay network. We were not signatories. We had not signed. And while we were sitting in this chamber not signing, Earth had been routing its construction communications through a private system the Council had no access to and no record of. We had not broken a rule. We had simply not agreed to a rule that would have broken us. The Marathi chair's bioluminescent lines were pulsing in short, rapid bursts. Are you saying that Earth has been conducting extraction operations in the outer belt throughout this negotiation period? I said, I am saying Earth has been building the infrastructure for extraction operations. The operations themselves are just beginning. The chair said, without council authorization, I said. We didn't require council authorization. We hadn't signed any document that required us to seek it. Another silence. Longer this time. I said, I want to be clear about something. Earth did not come to this table with the intention of conflict. We came here because we were invited. We read the document we were given. We found it to be structured in a way that was not consistent with a partnership between equals. Earth continued its work. That is all. Several other delegates began speaking at once. The Marathi chair attempted to restore order. The Velhari ambassador pushed back from the table, and then appeared to reconsider, and pushed his chair forward again. It was, I thought, the most honest thing this council had produced in 3 sessions. No careful language, no warm words about families, just the raw, vivid shock of a situation that had slipped entirely out of their control while they were watching me sit quietly and take notes. I waited for the noise to settle. When it did, I placed my hand on the 4-page document I had put on the table. I said, "This is not a counteroffer. This is not a demand. This is a proposal for a conversation that reflects where things actually stand. Earth is willing to talk. We are willing to cooperate. We are willing to be good partners in the outer belt, and in every territory beyond it. But any agreement we reach has to start from the truth." I looked around the room. I said, "The truth is that we built something. We built it carefully, and we built it well, and we built it without asking anyone's permission. It is simply a fact, and any document that does not account for that fact is not a real document. It's a wish." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "We're ready to talk about real documents whenever the council is ready." I picked up my pen. I did not use it. I just held it, resting against my fingers, visible to everyone in the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Marathi chair's bioluminescent lines had gone almost completely still. The Keth representatives' plates were flat and fixed in a way I had not seen before. Outside, through the chamber's single long window, the pale yellow planet turned in its slow orbit, rings bright in the starlight, completely indifferent to all of it. I waited. The council requested a recess that lasted 11 days. I did not push for a shorter one. I sent a brief message to the ministry, saying that negotiations were progressing, and that I would report further when there was something concrete to report. I sent a message to Gordon Reese saying only, "Hold course." His response came back in under a minute. "Steady as she goes." On the 4th day of the recess, the Velhari ambassador sent a formal request for a private meeting. Not breakfast this time. A working meeting, his message said, with technical advisors present on both sides. They were people who understood resource extraction, logistics, communications infrastructure, and legal frameworks. They came into the meeting room with the careful posture of people who had been told to be respectful, and were not entirely comfortable with that instruction. I brought Colin and 3 specialists I had kept off the official delegation list, a woman named Petra Dale, who had spent 8 years managing Earth's deep space logistics networks, a man named Owen Burrell, who had helped draft the legal language that defined the closed communications system Gordon Reese used, and a quiet woman named Sylvia Grant, who had been on the original probe survey team and knew the Outer Belt's geography better than anyone alive who wasn't currently stationed on one of the 9 platforms. The Velhari advisors looked at my 3 specialists, and then looked at each other, and I saw in that exchange the specific recognition of people who have realized they are in a room with the people who actually built the thing. We talked for 6 hours. Not about the old treaty. About the actual situation. Where the platforms were. What they were processing. What the capacity was. What it would look like in a year. In 5 years. In 20. The Velhari advisors asked careful questions and Petra, Owen, and Sylvia answered them with the kind of specificity that made the questions feel slightly beside the point. One of the Velhari advisors asked about extraction rates, and Sylvia placed a small physical model on the table that she had brought in a case, a detailed miniature of one of the platforms, printed to scale. She explained its operation in 9 sentences. The room was very quiet while she spoke. Afterward, the lead Velhari advisor said to me, "How long has this program been running?" I said, 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And throughout the treaty sessions?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You were never going to sign the original document." I said, "We were hoping we wouldn't have to refuse it outright. We were hoping the council would present something we could actually agree to." He said, "Why didn't you say that in session?" I said, "We did. In the way we knew how." He thought about that. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, "My grandmother would have understood you. She came from a species that colonized their own moon before they made first contact with anyone. She used to say that the worst thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other side define the starting line." She sounds like someone worth listening to." He almost smiled. For a creature of his physiology, that translated to a very slight relaxation of the upper membrane around his primary eyes. He said, "What does Earth actually want from this council?" I said, "A seat at the table that's built on what we've already done, not on what someone else thinks we're capable of. Recognition of our existing operations. No routing requirements for our communications. Clear ownership of the territories our probes charted. And a framework for expansion that treats us the way you'd treat any species of equivalent standing." He said, "Equivalent standing to whom?" To anyone who has built 9 independent platforms in the outer belt, and staffed them and run them for 4 years without asking anyone for help, he was quiet for a long time after that. When we left the meeting, Colin walked beside me and said nothing until we were back in the corridor. Then he said, "That last thing you said, that felt different." I said, "How?" He said, "Less like negotiation, more like a statement of fact." I said, "That's what it was." He thought about that. Then he said, "Some of the founding species are going to push back." I said, "Some of them will. The ones who pushed back hardest on the original percentages will push back again. But they'll have to do it in the open now, without the soft language." He said, "And that's better for us?" I said, "When someone has to argue against you openly, they have to use real reasons. Real reasons can be answered. It's the soft language that's hard to argue with." He nodded. Then he said, "What about the species that walk away from the table entirely?" I said, "Let them." He said, "That's a risk." I said, "Every choice is a risk. The question is what you're risking for." He thought about that for the rest of the walk back to the suite. The following morning, 3 more delegations requested working meetings. who had been mostly quiet throughout the earlier sessions but turned out to have the clearest thinking about mineral rights of anyone I had spoken to. Since arriving at the station, the Orvari delegate was a pale, slow-moving creature, with long fingers and the habit of pausing for several seconds between each sentence, as if it were checking its own work. It asked me, across a quiet table, whether Earth would be open to a shared infrastructure arrangement in sectors adjacent to our current platforms. I said we would be open to discussing it. Council yet. I said that was interesting. It slid a small data card across the table. It said that Earth and the Orvari had no prior history of misunderstanding, and that it believed the two species might find a working relationship easier to build than either would find with the older founding members. I picked up the data card. I looked at it. I looked at the Orvari delegate. I said, I think you might be right about that. It did the pause. Then it said, I thought so. That evening I sent the data card's contents to Sylvia Grant, who responded 6 hours later with a message that said, the survey data on Sector 7 is better than ours on 4 of our current sites. This changes some things. Start thinking about what we'd need to work there. She wrote back, already am. The rings were bright tonight, the star at a favorable angle. 2 days later, the Marathi chair formally announced that the council was ready to resume session, and that the agenda had been revised. The topic was no longer the original treaty. The topic was a new framework for human participation in outer belt operations. I got dressed carefully that morning. Colin met me at the door with coffee, and a look that was close to something I might have called optimism, which I had not seen on him in a while. He said, "Do we know what they're going to put on the table?" I said, "Parts of it. The Velhari will lead with recognition of our existing platforms, and then propose a corridor arrangement for the adjacent sectors, which they will want to present as generosity, before the Orvari can make the same offer on better terms." He said, "And the Keth?" I said, "The Keth will support whatever protects the founding species' existing stake in the Western Territories. They won't block us, but they'll push for a cap on expansion speed." He said, "And the Pruwan?" I said, "The Pruwan will not speak first. They'll watch the room and then side with whoever they believe is going to hold the majority." He said, "So who holds the majority?" I said, "Right now, us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did that happen?" I said, "Slowly, and then all at once." He looked at me. He said, "That's not actually an answer." I said, "It's the most honest one I have." We walked into the session together. I sat down in my chair. I placed my 4-page document on the table. I folded my hands. The Marathi chair opened the session. And for the first time since I had walked into this chamber, someone else was the one sitting down to wait. The session that changed everything did not start with a speech. It started with a question. The Marathi chair had barely finished calling the session to order when the Drovan ambassador, a species I had heard little from throughout the previous sessions, a compact, dense creature with overlapping scales of deep red that caught light the way old metal does, raised its communication node and said that before the revised framework could be discussed, it needed to raise a matter of immediate concern. The chair said that the floor was the Drovan ambassadors. The Drovan ambassador said that its government had received information from a source within Earth's construction program, suggesting that human activities in the outer belt represented a threat to established navigational corridors, used by multiple species. It said the scale of the construction was not what had been presented. It said Earth's 9 platforms were only part of a larger network. It said there were relay installations, supply depots, and secondary structures that had not been disclosed. The room shifted. I sat very still. The Drovan ambassador said that in light of these concerns, it was moving to suspend the revised framework discussion until a full independent audit of Earth's outer belt activities could be conducted by a council-appointed inspection body. Colin's hand, under the table, briefly touched my wrist, not to stop me from doing anything. Just the contact. I understood it. I waited for the ambassador to finish. Then I said, "I'd like to respond to that." The chair said the floor was mine. I said, "Earth disclosed its 9 operational platforms. We disclosed their locations, their staffing levels, and their processing capacity. That disclosure was accurate and complete as it applies to extraction platforms." I said, "What was not specifically itemized in